The morning after my daughter's engagement dinner, I sat in the parking lot of my financial advisor's office for 11 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I had the engine running. The heat was on, which was necessary because it was March in Sudbury and the temperature had dropped overnight to -14. I remember watching a crow land on the concrete barrier in front of me and just sit there, staring at nothing, which felt exactly right. I went inside when I was ready. Sylvia, who's managed my accounts for 19 years, came out to meet me in the lobby herself. She didn't send the assistant. She took one look at my face and said, "Come on back." I sat down across from her desk, put my purse on my lap, and told her what I wanted to do. She was quiet for a long moment. She folded her hands together the way she does when she's choosing her words carefully. Then she said, "Audrey, are you absolutely certain?" I told her I was. Let me go back. My name is Audrey, and I am 63 years old. I spent 22 years as a registered nurse at Health Sciences North, mostly in the cardiac unit, working nights for the last 9 of those years because nights paid better, and I needed every dollar I could find. I raised my daughter alone after her father and I divorced when she was 4. He moved to Fort McMurray for the oil work, and eventually started a second family. We were not close. I did not receive much help. What I did receive from my mother before she passed was a simple lesson about money that I have never forgotten. She used to say, "The money you don't touch is the money that protects you." She was a bookkeeper her whole life, never made much, but she died with no debt and a small inheritance for me and my brother. I took that inheritance, $42,000, and I did not buy a new car or a vacation or any of the things I had been quietly doing without for years. I put it in a registered account, and I left it alone. That was 28 years ago. I kept saving after that, slowly, carefully, the way you do when you are a nurse working nights, and you are tired all the time, and there is never quite enough of anything, but you keep going anyway, because there is a child who needs you. I maxed my RRSP every year I possibly could. When the mortgage on my house in the new Sudbury neighborhood was paid off, I took what had been the mortgage payment and redirected it. I didn't tell anyone. There was no one to tell, really. My daughter Renee knew I was careful with money. She knew we didn't waste. She grew up understanding that we bought things when they were on sale, and we didn't go into debt for things that weren't necessary. But she didn't know the shape of things. Why would she? I didn't sit her down and go through the numbers. That's not how my mother raised me, and I suppose it's not how I raised her either. Money, where I come from, is a private matter. Renee is 34 now. She is a landscape architect. She works for a firm in Barrie, and she's very good at what she does. She is also, as of 8 months ago, engaged to a man I will call my son-in-law, because that is all he is to me now, a role, not a person I have any feeling for. His name is Brandon. He is 37. His family has money. Real money, the kind that came from his grandfather's manufacturing business and was passed down, not earned. They live in a large house in a good neighborhood in Barrie, and they belong to a golf club, and his mother, whose name I will not use here because I don't want to give her that, drives a car that costs more than I paid for my first house. I knew from the beginning that they found me lacking, not rude about it, not overtly, just the particular brand of polite that is actually a form of management, keeping someone at a comfortable distance with good manners and mild disinterest. When we were introduced, Brandon's mother smiled warmly and said it was so wonderful to meet Renee's mum, and then she spent the rest of the evening talking to everyone else. I noticed. I am a nurse. I have spent my entire career reading people in moments of stress, and I am very rarely wrong about what I'm seeing. But Renee was happy, and so I said nothing, and I smiled, and I brought a lemon tart to the first family dinner, and I was gracious, and I kept my observations to myself. The engagement dinner was held at a restaurant in Barrie that I will not name, but that I looked up afterward and confirmed charges between $40 and $70 for a main course. The occasion was to celebrate the engagement officially, with both families present. I drove down from Sudbury on a Friday afternoon in February, in the snow, which took nearly 4 hours because of the weather on the 69. I had brought a gift. I want to tell you about this gift because it matters. It is the center of everything. When Renee was small, maybe 5 or 6, she used to come into the kitchen on Saturday mornings and pull a chair over to the counter and stand beside me while I cooked. Not to help, really, just to be there. She would rest her chin on her hands and watch and ask questions. What does that smell like when it's done? Why do you add the salt at the end? Can I stir? I would let her stir, and she would stir with the kind of concentration that small children have, completely absorbed, very serious about it. I wrote all of this down, not all at once, over years in pieces whenever I remembered something, a recipe I'd learned from my own mother, a dish Renee had eaten 3 bowls of at 7 years old, a soup I made every January because she had told me once it was the thing she most associated with winter and safety and being home. I wrote the recipes out longhand in a hardcover notebook with a dark green cover, and beside each one I wrote the memory that went with it. Not long, not sentimental in a theatrical way, just true. Here is the stew. Here is the afternoon I made it when you were sick and had the flu, and we watched movies on the couch and you fell asleep against my arm. I had been adding to it for years. I finished it in January, wrote out the last recipe, her grandmother's butter tarts, which Renee has asked for at every Christmas since she was old enough to have preferences, and I tied a green ribbon around the cover and I put it in my bag for the dinner. I thought it would mean something to her. I thought it was the right gift. The dinner was fine, in the way that dinners are fine when everyone is being careful. Renee looked beautiful. Brandon was attentive. His parents were at the head of the table in the way that hosts are, directing things, and his mother was charming in the polished way I had already learned to recognize, asking me about Subri with an expression of faint, benign curiosity that you might use when asking someone about a place you had no intention of ever visiting. There were speeches. His father spoke. Brandon spoke. Renee cried a little, the good kind, and held on to Brandon's arm, and I thought, she is happy, this is the thing that matters. I can manage the rest. When the speeches were done and the dessert had been cleared, Renee said, Mum brought a gift. She looked at me with a kind of bright expectancy that I recognized as hope, as the look she used to give me when she had done something she was proud of and wanted me to see. I took the notebook out of my bag and held it across the table to her. Renee untied the ribbon. She opened the first page. She read the first line, which was something I had written about a Saturday in November 1996, and her face changed in a way that told me she understood exactly what she was holding. And then Brandon's mother said from across the table in a voice that was perfectly pleasant and therefore somehow worse for it, Oh, a recipe book. How charming. Very homespun. There was a pause. I looked at Renee. Renee was looking down at the notebook. Her face had gone careful in a way I recognized and did not like. Brandon said nothing. His mother continued, to no one in particular, filling the silence she'd created. We have a wonderful cooking class series at the club. I'll add you to the list, Renee. Professional instruction is such a lovely gift to yourself. She said it pleasantly. She was smiling. She was already reaching for her wine. Brandon was still saying nothing. I want to be clear about this part because it is the part that made the decision for me, not his mother's comment, which I had expected in some form, because people like her always find a way. It was the silence. It was my daughter's intended sitting 6 inches from me, while his mother diminished a gift I had spent years building and choosing, very deliberately, not to speak. I have worked nights. I have sat with patients in the last hours of their lives. I have delivered bad news to families in waiting rooms, and I have held the hands of strangers when there was no one else. I know what it costs to speak when speaking is hard. I know also what it means when someone simply chooses not to. I reached across the table. I picked a notebook up from Renee's hands. I said, I'll hold on to this for now. Renee looked at me with an expression I could not fully read. I put the notebook back in my bag. I said the dinner had been lovely. I thanked Brandon's parents for hosting. I hugged Renee, who held on for a moment longer than usual, and I got my coat and I walked out to the parking lot. I sat in my car and I called my friend Glennis, who has known me for 31 years and who does not give advice I haven't asked for. I said, Something happened tonight, and I need to think it through. She said, "Okay, drive safe." I drove back to Sudbury in the dark, 4 hours, the highway clear by then, no weather. I got home at midnight and I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and I thought about it. By the time I went to bed, I had made up my mind. The next morning I called Sylvia's office as soon as they opened. Here is something I should explain because without it the rest of this won't make sense. When I retired from nursing 4 years ago, I had been contributing to registered accounts for over 2 decades. I had also, in the years after the mortgage was paid off, begun investing more deliberately. Nothing complicated, nothing speculative, just a consistent, unglamorous strategy that Sylvia had helped me maintain. Index funds, mostly, the kind of investing that is boring and slow and correct. I did not talk about it. I did not think about it in dramatic terms. It was just the thing I did instead of spending money I didn't need to spend. I had also, 12 years ago, done something that surprised even Sylvia. I bought a small rental property, a 2-bedroom house on a quiet street in the South End, a 10-minute walk from the hospital. An elderly couple had been the owners and they needed to sell quickly when the husband's health required them to move closer to family. I paid $232,000 for it. I had saved the down payment over 6 years. The rental income covered the mortgage in 18 months. Then I bought another property, then a third, when a small duplex came available at an estate sale and I looked at the numbers and they made sense. I was methodical about it. I used a property management company, so I was not receiving midnight calls about plumbing. I did not tell people. It was not something I discussed at dinner parties, in part because I did not attend many dinner parties, and in part because it seemed to me that money, like faith and illness, is a thing people should be allowed to keep private. By the morning after the engagement dinner, I held title to 6 residential properties in Sudbury, all of them tenanted. The mortgage on my own home was long paid off. My investment portfolio, between registered and non-registered accounts, had grown to a number that still surprised me when Sylvia said it aloud, which she had done at my last review appointment, looking at me with the very particular expression of someone who has watched a long patience pay off. None of this was dramatic. It was just time. Time and the stubborn refusal to spend money I didn't have to spend. Renee didn't know. Why would she? I was her mother. I brought lemon tarts to family dinners, and I drove a 7-year-old Subaru and I clipped sale coupons at the grocery store. Not because I needed to, but because it was the habit of a lifetime, and habits are hard to unstitch. If you had looked at me from the outside, this woman, 63, retired nurse, Sudbury, sensible boots, you would not have seen what Sylvia saw when she looked at my file. Brandon's mother certainly didn't. What I asked Sylvia to do was not an act of anger. I want to be honest about that. By the time I sat across from her desk, I had moved through the anger on the drive home the night before. What I felt now was something quieter and more settled, a clarity. I had been in the process of updating my estate planning, standard review, the kind you do in your 60s when you are organized and forward-thinking and have watched enough patients die without their paperwork in order to understand why it matters. Sylvia and my lawyer were both involved. Certain decisions had been in draft, but not finalized. What I told Sylvia was that I wanted to finalize things, and I wanted to make one significant change to the direction of my charitable giving. I had already earmarked a substantial portion of my estate to go to Health Sciences North's cardiac unit, which had been my professional home for 22 years, and which I knew from the inside was chronically under-resourced in ways that directly affected patient care. That stayed. What I changed was this. I had also planned to set up a living fund during my own lifetime to help Renee and her husband when they eventually bought a home. First-time buyers in Ontario are struggling in ways my generation did not have to, and I had wanted to ease that. $150,000 set aside and waiting. I redirected it to a women's emergency shelter on Elm Street that I had been quietly supporting for years. They were in the middle of a capital campaign to expand their transitional housing. My contribution would be enough to add 6 additional units. I signed the paperwork before noon. I drove home. I made a pot of the January soup. Renee called me that evening. She didn't say much at first. She asked how the drive had been, whether the roads were bad. I said the roads were fine. There was a silence. Then she said, "Mum, why did you take the book back?" I said, "Because it wasn't the right moment." She was quiet again. Then she was out of line. I know she was out of line. I asked her why she hadn't said anything. Another silence. Longer this time. "I didn't want to make a scene," she said. "It was supposed to be a nice evening." I told her I understood that. I told her I wasn't angry at her. Both of these things were true and not the whole truth. I said, "I've been thinking about something your grandmother used to say. She said, the first time someone shows you who they are, believe them. And the first time someone you love watches it happen and says nothing, believe them too." Renee was crying. I could hear it in the controlled, quiet way she cries, the same way she's cried since she was a teenager. "I didn't know what to do," she said. "I know," I said. I meant it. I understood that she was in a position that was genuinely hard, in love, wanting peace, caught between people she cared about. I did not think she was a bad person. I thought she was a person who, in a moment of difficulty, had made a choice, and I thought it was important to be honest with myself about what that choice told me. I told her that I loved her. I told her I would always love her. I told her the book was safe, and I had no plans to burn it. She laughed a little, wet and wobbly. "I didn't think you were going to burn it, Mum." "Good," I said. "Then we understand each other." Brandon called me 2 days later. I did not expect this. I had, I admit, made certain assumptions about him based on available evidence, and one of those assumptions was that he would prefer to let the whole thing quietly dissolve. He called on a Tuesday morning. I was having coffee and reading the paper, the print edition, which I refused to give up, and my phone rang with his name on it, and I sat with it for a moment before I answered. He apologized. He said his mother had been inappropriate and he should have said something and he didn't, and he was sorry. He said it directly, without a lot of decoration, which I respected. I told him I appreciated the call. I told him the apology was for Renee as much as for me, that she was the one who needed to hear what he was capable of. He said he knew. I said, "Good. I don't know what will happen with Brandon. People can surprise you. Nurses learn this early and we don't unlearn it. I have seen frightened people become brave and thoughtless people become careful, and I try not to make permanent judgments based on a single evening." What I told Renee when she asked me later whether I liked him was honest. I said I thought he was capable of better than he had shown, and that I hoped for her sake he would show it consistently, because one phone call was a beginning and not an ending. 3 weeks after the dinner, I asked Renee to come up for the weekend. She came alone, which I had hoped for. We spent Saturday doing the things we do. We walked the snow trail out by Ramsey Lake in the morning. We ate lunch at the diner on Paris Street that we've been going to since she was in high school. We came home and I cooked, and she sat at the kitchen counter on a stool and watched me. And the particular quality of that watching, chin resting on her hand, paying close attention, was identical to the way she had watched at 5 years old, standing on a chair. I took the green notebook out and put it on the counter beside her. She put her hand on it but didn't open it. I said, "I want to give this to you properly, when you're ready for it." She asked what properly meant. I said, "It means in a moment when the people around you know what it is." She nodded, and she didn't push further, and that felt right. We made her grandmother's butter tarts that evening. The recipe is on page 41. We made a mess of the kitchen and we used real lard in the pastry the way my mother insisted you had to, and we stood at the counter eating them before they had fully cooled, which is the only correct way, and Renee got pastry on her chin, and neither of us said anything important for a long time. In April, I invited Renee and Brandon to dinner. Just the three of us. I made the January soup and I set the table properly, and I put a candle on it, which I don't do for everyday meals. At some point during the evening, Brandon's mother came up, indirectly, not dramatically, just in the natural conversation of family. Brandon said something about a decision she had made that he disagreed with. Then he said something else. Then he said more carefully that he had been thinking about the engagement dinner and that he owed me more than a phone call, that he should have stalked his mother that evening and he didn't, and he wanted me to understand that he knew it. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about what Sylvia had said to me. Back in March, he called you Audrey. That's not nothing. I said, thank you for saying that. I did not tell him about the fund. I did not tell him about any of it. That is not information he needs, and in my experience, the people who deserve to know the shape of your life will come to understand it slowly through the evidence of who you are, not through a single dramatic revelation. Renee knows now, though. I told her in May, quietly at the kitchen table, with coffee between us. I showed her the portfolio summary, the property statements, the document redirecting the housing fund. I told her everything. She was very still for a long time. Then she said, Mum, all those years? I said, all those years. She asked me why I had never told her. I thought about my mother and her mother before that, and the long, unspoken tradition of women who held things quietly because holding was the work they knew how to do. I suppose I wasn't sure it was something to talk about, I said. It was just what I did with the time. Renee reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She didn't say anything, which was the right response. Words would have been too small for it. I thought about the crow in the parking lot, sitting on the concrete barrier, not going anywhere in particular, just present, just there. I thought about the butter tarts on page 41. I refilled our coffee and we sat there for another hour, not doing much of anything, just being in the same room, which is sometimes the whole of what love is. I keep thinking about the crow in the parking lot that morning, just sitting there on the concrete barrier, not going anywhere, not in a hurry about anything. At the time, I thought it was a strange thing to notice. Now I think I understand it better. Some mornings you just have to sit with what happened before you can decide what to do next. What I know, after 63 years of living, is that the way things turn out is rarely accidental. Not in a mystical sense. I'm not someone who believes the universe is keeping score or handing out lessons on a schedule. But I do believe that how you carry yourself across a lifetime tends to accumulate into something. The discipline of choosing the harder right thing over the easier wrong one, year after year, in small, unremarkable ways, that accumulates. It becomes the shape of your life whether you planned it that way or not. I spent 22 years on the cardiac unit at night, tired in a way that doesn't fully leave your body, making choices nobody noticed. I redirected money instead of spending it. I bought a quiet house on a quiet street and did the arithmetic and signed the papers and didn't talk about it. None of that felt significant at the time. It was just the next right thing, repeated until it became a habit, repeated until the habit became something that could actually hold weight when weight was put on it. What I want to say to anyone who watched this and recognized something in it, in the dinner, in the silence, in the drive home in the dark, is this: the work you do when no one is watching is not wasted. The patience you practice when there's no reward for it yet is not wasted. The standard you quietly hold yourself to, even when the people around you don't share it, is not wasted. Renee asked me once, sitting at the kitchen table in May with coffee between us, why I had never told her. And I said I supposed I wasn't sure it was something to talk about, that it was just what I did with the time. But I've been thinking about that answer, and I think there's more to it. I think I also believed, somewhere beneath the habits and the silence, that the right kind of knowing takes time, that you don't really understand what someone is by what they tell you about themselves. You understand it eventually through evidence, through who they are when things are ordinary and when things are hard, through what they choose when the choice costs something. Brandon called me. That mattered, not because a phone call erases a silence, but because it told me he was paying attention to the right things and that he was willing to do the uncomfortable work of saying so. That's not a small thing. That's actually the whole thing, really. Being willing to look clearly at what you did wrong and say it plainly and mean it. The notebook is still on the shelf in my kitchen. Renee will have it when the time is right. Not as a reward, and not as a withheld thing, but simply when the moment is one that knows what it's holding. The butter tarts are on page 41. We'll get there,